Hello and welcome to the FSAI Breakfast Bite on food labelling. I'm Elaine Gibson and I will be your host of sorts this morning. You're most welcome. Today I'm joined by Clodagh Crehan, who looks after labelling in the FSAI. Today's event will last for 40 minutes. There will be a 30-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute Q&A. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, you can pop them into the chat box. We have put together some handouts in the handout section if you want to have a little look through those, and you can download those to your laptop if you wish. And finally, if you are on social media, do let us know you're here with hashtag FSAI events. And now, without further ado, I will pass you over to Clodagh.
Thanks very much, Elaine, and good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to this morning's session on food labelling. I suppose first of all, it's great to see we've quite a number of attendees at the webinar this morning, which is great. But I suppose, given the whole subject of food labelling, the fact that there are so many requirements and provisions under the labelling legislation, and indeed the fact that we also then have to take into account the exemptions and derogations, it's fair to say that food labelling as a subject can be challenging for yourselves as food business operators, and indeed, from the regulatory point of view. So I'm going to now switch off my camera just at the moment, and I'll go through the slides, but I'll join back in again at the end when we have the questions and answers. And as Elaine said, feel free, whatever your question is, send it into the chat function and we'll try and address it at the end. So I'll just turn off the camera there now. Okay, so let's kick on and we'll have a look at what I'm hoping to cover. And I suppose really what I should say at this point in the meeting is that I'm just going to try and check the slides and I just don't seem to want to click on. So maybe we're now. What we want to cover, I suppose, as I said, food labelling is that type of a subject. It's so vast. We would need 2 days really to go through in a workshop all of the different particulars. But what I would really hope to cover in the next, half an hour or so, and with our questions at the end, looking at the fundamental principles of labelling pre-packed foods. We also want to take a look at the responsibilities for food business operators, because I suppose that is the core. Again, obviously the important part then is the information that must be on the label. And then I'm going to take a little just talk at the end about nutrition and health claims. And I suppose even though nutrition and health claims are coming from a different piece of legislation, it's still the information that will end up on the label of your pre-packed food. And so all of this information has to be looked at in its entirety. When we review any food labels, or if we have any queries sent into the FSAI for, questions or areas that aren't quite clear, we need to review the label in its entirety so we can look at all of the different aspects coming together. But before I begin, and as I said, these are the areas we're going to cover, I just want to pose a quick poll if I can. And if I could ask you just very quickly to have a look at this question: do you consider this a pre-packed food? And if I could get you really just to have a look and maybe just quickly answer, see if you can get the poll going. So the poll is open there. So we'll have a quick, okay, so interesting enough, the spread of the numbers. So keep your votes coming. Great. Okay, well, look, that's something good to start us off with, really. And what I'm going to do now is not really go so much on the result of that at the moment. What I'm going to do now is go through some of the next slides, and we'll revisit this question as we come through. Okay, so what is the piece of legislation that we're dealing with? It's Regulation 1169 of 2011. It's referred to as FIC, Food Information to Consumers, or indeed you may refer to it as FIR, which is Food Information Regulation. The document itself, you'll see the screenshot of the front of the piece of legislation. It shows you all of the other pieces of legislation that were repealed when this came in, when it was published in 2011. The document is quite substantial. There's 60 pages of provisions, and while we look at some of them today, taking out each of them to summarize them, what I would like just to say is the red leaflet there on the screen is a really good tool to summarize all of the requirements. So that is part of the resources that Elaine has made available. So you'll find that very useful as you look at your own food labels. So in terms of what food information is, it's defined in that legislation as information concerning a food and made available to the final consumer by means of a label. So we're all familiar with the technical physical label that goes on your food product. But the key thing here is that it also applies to other accompanying material or other means, including modern technology tools. So it's a wider scope now for food information. So really what we're talking about here is that it's not just the food it's not just the information you put on your food label, but it's also going to consider any other advertising or promotional materials. Do you have leaflets, flyers? Do you have any other campaigns to promote your food product? Also, do you declare any food information on your website? So that's really key, and indeed social media. So as the trend changes in terms of how food businesses market, and indeed with the whole COVID, many food businesses have turned to online selling of their food. But just you must be mindful that this information under FIC applies in all cases, not just on your label. The fundamental principles of labeling a pre-packed food, they're quite straightforward. In terms of the information must be clear, it must be unambiguous, legible and easy to understand. And the other point there in blue, it says in English, and then in brackets, other languages permitted. So the bottom line here is that your information that you put on the label must be easy to read for the consumer and clear. In terms of the languages, obviously we have to have it in English for our Irish consumers. However, you may have the information in other languages where your space permits. And I've also just a little sideline there with the font size, just to emphasize that these rules now set down a specific mandatory font size for all of your required information. So if you are looking to maybe produce a label for many different markets, you can do so provided the space prevails to allow you fit all of the mandatory information in English and in the other languages. So just to be mindful that, and again, we see a lot of labels that will have the company story or the nice history of the product, and that's fine, provided there's space to allow all of your mandatory information to fit in. Okay, so sorry, before I skip on, sorry, the other key point there in the green is that the consumer must not be misled. And there are a number of ways that the consumer could be misled, and it's set down in Article 7 of FIC. And really, I suppose, to simplify it, if there's anything on the label that could cause concern or confusion to the consumer in terms of pictorial graphics or information that's on the label, there could be a confusion in terms of the identity or the composition. So it's quite, Article 7 covers the whole misleading bit, and obviously in terms of then looking at different labels, on a case-by-case basis, we would have to apply this to determine if the label is misleading. As food business operators, your responsibilities are in that the person or the business responsible for the food information, so the person who's responsible for labeling the food, is the operator under whose name the business is marketed. So if it's your own food business name and address that's going on the label, you're responsible for the information that's placed on there. You may have that labels are produced for a supermarket or for particular retailers, and in that case then it will be up to between the producer and the retailer to decide. So in that case, more than likely be the retailer. So it's important to understand that there has to be a responsible person for the information that goes on each food label. As I said, the information must be present, obviously, and accurate. And really the whole idea here with food labeling is that all of the information must be passed along the chain so that it allows every food business in that chain to have the information at hand. So if it was a case of you were packaging food for maybe your restaurant or a restaurant chain, well, in that case, you must be able to pass on the food information so that restaurant will have it at their side and they will be able to impart the information as necessary to their consumers. So that's covered in Article 8 of FIC, which is kind of a new entry into the whole legislation. Okay, so let's move on to what information must be on the label. I have a whole list here, points 1 to 11. For today, I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want to flag, you'll see that at point 1, the name of the food, number 4, the net quantity, and number 10, the alcoholic strength for beverages with greater than 1.2% alcohol. Those 3 pieces of information must be in the same field division on your label. And what do we mean by field division? Well, when you take one surface, whether any surface on your food label, that a consumer can read these pieces of information at one single viewing, and it's all contained there. Obviously, the alcoholic strength one is only specific to alcoholic beverages, but in the case of the others, you will have the name and the net quantity, which in the example here, we can see our pizza name and the net quantity. So just to be mindful, it's another little part of the provisions that we have to also consider. Going back to the full list of the 11, then I'm going to look at the list of ingredients that are considered as allergenic. I'm going to look at date of minimum durability, origin labeling, and nutrition declaration. So these are kind of, I suppose, key ones that create much discussion and much conversation. There are provisions for all of the other ones. We have ample information on our website, and indeed, as I said, in our red leaflet, and we'll talk about those at the end. In terms of ingredients then, obviously any pre-packed food product that has many ingredients, you must list those for the consumer to identify what's present. The ingredients must start with a heading that includes the word ingredients. Each of the ingredients used must be listed in descending order of weight at the mixing bowl stage. So in other words, your recipe, the largest to the smallest ingredient that you use. The ingredients must be listed in the declaration or the ingredients list by their specific name. So I mean by that is that you must only put the name of the actual ingredient you used, not a different name that may give it a better look or a better idea in the consumer's mind. So it's the actual ingredient name that you use. And just to point out that there is a small list of food products that are exempt from having to give a list of ingredients, but it's a very tight list. For example, fresh fruit and vegetables, you won't see a list of ingredients obviously here unless they've been peeled, chopped. So if you see any mixer or any bag that's packaged off, in that case you will see a list of ingredients. You won't see a list of ingredients for anything that's a single ingredient food, because obviously it's clear by the name what's in there, alcoholic beverages and carbonated water. So as I said, a very short list, but in all other cases you'll have your list of ingredients in descending order of weight with the heading ingredients. Moving on now, we look at the allergenic ingredients, and again this will form part of your list of ingredients, but there's an extra layer in that you must now highlight these ingredients to the consumer. So you'll see them listed here. We have the 14 listed, and I'll also say that we also refer to categories as well, because if we look at the cereals, there's a number of different cereals that contain gluten. With the nuts, the tree nuts, there's a number of different lists in the list there. So if you use any one of these particular ingredients, you must highlight it on the list of ingredients. So you can see here for the cereals, it's not gluten that you label, it's the actual cereal that contains gluten. So be it wheat, barley, rye. In the case of the tree nuts, if you use any of those in your list of ingredients, you must highlight the name, Brazil nuts, hazelnuts, whatever it is. And all of the rest of them are straightforward then. You can see that we have a separate category for peanuts, we have milk, we have eggs, sesame, and sulfur dioxide is another one that we need to consider, because it's only at levels greater than 10 milligrams per kilogram that's considered allergenic. So if your sulfur dioxide that you use for whatever reason in your food, if it's below the 10 milligrams per kilogram, you don't have to highlight it. It's not considered allergenic. So these are very important to consider. We have a number of resource material as well on our website, which are very useful for being able to identify and list off all of the allergens for each particular food product that you make. So if you don't actually have that checklist, it would be a very good one to get as well to help you out in your food business. So moving on, just in terms of on the label, you'll see a little small example at the top there. For prepackaged foods, the allergens must be declared obviously in the list of ingredients, but they must be emphasized using a typeset which clearly distinguishes it from all other ingredients. Now, it seems to be the industry norm to use bold for the allergenic ingredients. It could be any other method, whether it's a different font size, font color, but the key thing is that the consumer can identify these ingredients very clearly. The other point at the end of the slide there is just to say that in the case of, I mentioned foods that don't need a list of ingredients, well, in that case, then you will just use the word contains and then egg, milk, soya as your allergen. So if there's no ingredient list required by law, you just use the word contains. Otherwise, you're listing it as in the example there in the full list of ingredients, and you're highlighting it. Okay, so moving on then to additives. These form part of the ingredients list as well, and I suppose additives is a whole other day's work in terms of legislation and the different types of additives that can be used for different functions, be it to color or preserve or thicken your food. And obviously under the specific additives legislation, you need to be sure that you're permitted to use a particular additive in your food. But when it comes to the labeling of that, then you're required in the list of ingredients to indicate the category of the additive, so it's preservative or a thickener or a color, followed by either the name of the additive or the E number. So the example here would be color green S, you can label it like that, or you can say color E42. Similarly for flavor enhancer, you've got the category there, flavor enhancer, and it can either be the name monosodium glutamate or flavor enhancer E621. But the point I have to really flag here is that if it's an allergen, if the additive contains an allergenic ingredient, which sulfur dioxide would, it's not permitted just to use the E number. So in this case, you must give the full additive name. So in this case, it would be preservative as the category and sodium sulfite as the full name of the additive. And then you can see we've also highlighted the word sulfite because that's the allergenic part. So that's just something else to consider in terms of declaring your list of ingredients. If we move on now, we've got the best before, or really the date declaration on foods, and you've got two different types of date markings that I'll bring up here. The first one, and it's amazing that this tends to confuse a lot in terms of consumer purchases. The best before date that's declared on a label is a quality indicator. Okay, it's for long shelf life foods that they're not perishable. They don't tend to spoil. They'll get stale or they'll get soft after a given time, but they're not unsafe. In terms of the second date, it's a use by date, which is a safety indicator. And from a microbiological point of view, foods that have a use by date are highly perishable and will more than likely, after a short time, cause danger to human health. So most of your chilled products, most of your short shelf products will have a use by date. And in the use by date, you'll also have to, on the label, give a description of the storage condition. So is it stored at between 0 to 4 degrees? There may also be an indication then under the storage instructions that once something has been opened, what do you do with it then? How long will it last? So these are all to determine the safety of the food products that are on the market. It's up to the food business operator to decide what date goes on the label, but it's done so considering the qualities and the characteristics of the food themselves, and also shelf life testing. So it's not a case of looking at other brands on the market and maybe comparing dates. You have to be able to justify the date that you put on the label. And just to say that our guidance note number 18, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland's guidance note 18, is very useful when you're looking at the whole date marking. Again, we have an exemption, a short list of foods that don't need a date marking, so fresh fruit and vegetables again, wine, cheese, vinegar, etc. So very specific food products, everything else must have the date. How you display the date then, this is covered in one of the annexes at the back of FIC, and for a use by date, again, it's a short shelf life, so you'll need day and month. You can give the year if you so wish, but generally it's going to be within the next 5 to 10 days. So day and month is fine. If you are giving for the best before date, then if that's the date you're declaring on your food, you have 3 options. If the food lasts up to 3 months, again, it's a short enough time, so best before the day and the month is fine. And you must use the word best before. Between 3 and 18 months, it's sufficient to say best before end of the month and the year. So in the case of best before end July 2020 or end November 2020, again using the word best before. And if it's a food product that will last greater than 18 months, the best before declaration will be best before end year. So it's the end of 2021. So you'll see that on a number of different, shelf stable products. When you look at them, they're declared differently, but using one of the 3 options there. Okay, so we'll move on to origin labelling, which again is further down on our list of mandatory points. And again, I suppose origin labelling is one that causes plenty of discussion. And again, I suppose given that there are a number of different pieces of legislation and a number of different ways, as I mentioned, that a consumer could be misled. The very basic principle of having to declare origin on a food label is that it is not required unless you mislead the consumer. So for mainstream products, for a lot of the compound products that have many ingredients in them, you're not expected to give an origin declaration unless your label has a flag or an emblem or a colour scheme that could imply an origin from a certain country. And in that case, it's prompting you on for further legislation. Just also to say, and again, this is something that we could have a whole other discussion on origin, there are specific rules in place for certain food products that require origin. So honey, for example, honey has specific, in its own piece of legislation, has specific requirements as declaring EU and non-EU honey in the case of it being blended. The likes of beef, we've had beef origin rules dating way back to 2000 from the whole FSAI crisis. So any beef that you see in the supermarket prepackaged or indeed loose at the butchery counter will have to give you the origin details. And only since then, 2015, had we the introduction of another piece of legislation falling out of FIC that now requires the origin declaration on pork, lamb, poultry and goat meat. So that's fresh, chilled or frozen meat from those animals. If any of those pork, lamb or poultry are used with other ingredients, for example, in a stir fry, it's exempt then, it's out of those rules. But outside of that, if you're just packaging off poultry, chicken fillets or lamb cutlets, you must give the origin. So they're under specific rules. And the third point on this slide I just want to mention is that, and this is probably one that's going to affect a lot more of the food businesses now, is that since April 2020, new legislation came into force, again falling out of FIC, and this then required the origin of a primary ingredient where it's different to that of the final food. So what do I mean by this? If we take a beef lasagna, okay, and the lasagna is made in Ireland, so you can label it as produced in Ireland for whoever, whatever retailer perhaps. But the problem here is that you've given an indication of origin that the lasagna was produced in Ireland. That could lead consumers to believe that all of the ingredients in the lasagna is Irish, but where the beef isn't Irish, so maybe the beef has come from another member state, well, in that case, this particular piece of legislation prompts you to also give an origin declaration for the primary ingredient, which in this case would be beef in the lasagna. And just to say that primary ingredient is defined in those new rules as being the ingredient greater than 50% of the final food. So it would be beef being greater than 50% in the final lasagna, or just the ingredient being associated with the food. So you could have it that the beef in the final lasagna is not actually greater than 50%, but it's obviously associated with the food because that's why you're buying the beef lasagna. So, you know, as I said, these probably aren't the most straightforward rules under FIC, but the real rule of thumb here is that if your product doesn't mislead in any way and there are no specific rules in place for your food product, you don't have to give any origin labeling. If, however, on your label you do use any flag, emblem, picture, any way that could mislead the consumer as to the origin of that food, well, then you're prompted under the new rules since April 2020. It's regulation 2018-775. You'll find details of that and a Q&A on our website, but this will bring you within the scope of these rules. So we'll move on now just to have a look. I've covered the areas that I want to cover in terms of the ingredients, in terms of allergens, and the date declaration and origin labeling, okay? What I want to say at this stage is that these rules apply obviously to anything that's pre-packed and it's available for sale to the consumer. So any retail outlet, any small corner shop, pre-packed food, those rules apply. In the case of, in the picture here, you'll see if it's a food business that's operating business to business sales, and I mentioned that earlier, if your business produces bulk packed products to supply to the restaurant trade, in that case, you are still subject to the FIC rules, okay? However, there's a slight derogation in that you only have to give 4 pieces of information on the outside of your bulk box. So in other words, you must give your product name, so what is in the box, the best before or use by date, the storage instructions, and the business name and address. Those 4 pieces of information must go on the outside label or package of your bulk pack going to another business. The intention here of this information is that when that product, that bulk product is received by the restaurant, they can identify from the box what it is, the date in which it must be used by, how to store it obviously, and who supplied it. And the other key thing then, it's only a derogation. All of the mandatory information that we've gone through and that we've seen on the list of 11 must be on the commercial documents anyway that go along with the business, go along with the food to the business. So the intention here, and you remember I said under the responsibilities, is that all of the food information will carry its way through the food chain to the restaurant that receives the bulk product, and they will have all the information at hand. So if I go along to the restaurant and I order a certain meal, and if I want to query anything with regard to the ingredients of certain products, the staff within the restaurant will have the information at hand. So that's where the rules apply. In case then of non-prepacked food, so again under FIC, under Article 44, it allows then some exemptions, I suppose, to the whole rules to have to label everything on the outside label. Obviously, food's sold loose. So if you go to your supermarket, to your deli counter, or any other, you know, your sandwich bar, the food is loose. It doesn't have to have a label, so you're not going to see all the mandatory information. Obviously, all that information is available on site because with the business-to-business transaction, all the information is available, but it doesn't have to be made available to you. You'll just see the name of the product, or you'll see the allergen information. The other derogation would be for anything that's packed on the premises from which it's sold. So if you have a product that's packed in store on any given day to be put out on a display for the consumer to pick up, that is considered as a non-prepacked food. And the third option then would be anything that's packed at the consumer's request. So if you go into your sandwich bar and you order a number of ingredients in your sandwich, then these are considered as being packed at the request of the consumer, and they're all treated as non-prepacked. So if we go back to our question then, and it was interesting to see that we had a pretty even spread of who considered this a pre-packed food or not. And you'll see now how the rules, as you look at the product, the loaf, it should be considered a pre-packed. It's closed off. There's no way of touching the food. But because the food is actually packed on the premises from which it's sold, you don't consider it as a full pre-packed, and it doesn't need the full information. So in this case, what you'll find is that you'll have to give the allergen information on the loaf. You'll see it in the middle picture there. And if there was any other product specific information. But just for this bread, it will just be the allergen information that you will see. It could be stuck on a little sticker if you want on the product, but it's fine to have it on a little shelf talker in front to tell you that this bread will contain wheat, egg, milk, etc. So just that was interesting just to see, and we can see that that falls under the non-prepacked under Article 44. In terms of allergen declaration then, how you present the allergen information, it can be at the point of presentation, point of sale, or point of supply, and I spoke about that with the loaf of bread. Just a quick word on selling online. I mentioned if you're operating your business online, this is really where there's no interaction between you as the food business operator and your customers. In that case, you must make all of the mandatory information that I've spoken on some points, but all of the 11, you must make that information available to your customers online or in some form before they make their purchase. The only thing that you won't be able to give is the best before or the use by date, because obviously that won't apply until you have the product ready for dispatch. Once the product is going to the consumer, you will then give the information on the date, so they will have all of the mandatory information again when they receive the food. So that's really important to note, that the customer needs all this information to be able to make their food choice. So they need to know about ingredients, they need to know about allergens and how to store and how to use the food product. I'll flag you to the selling online. Again, this is a really good leaflet as well, which will support the other labelling leaflets. So this is a really good one to use if you are actually selling your food online. And again, it's available in the window. So if we move on quickly, I'm going to look at nutrition labelling and nutrition and health claims. These are a little bit quicker because there's not as much detail. This is the legal minimum in terms of a nutrition declaration. You can see the order of the nutrients, energy, fat, of which saturates, carbohydrate, of which sugar, protein, salt, etc. Note that it's a salt declaration and not sodium anymore, and you must give the information per 100 grams or 100 mils of the actual amount. That's the legal minimum. There are a number of other add-ons that you can give. The first being that you can add supplementary nutrients that are highlighted here in red. You don't have to give all of them. You can pick one or two of them to add into the previous table. Okay, so you could have this table with just fiber added in. You will see there that again, they're listed per 100 grams or 100 mils in their actual amount. But then for vitamins and minerals, you will give the actual amounts in their units, which will be micrograms or milligrams, but you must also, for the vitamins and minerals, give the percentage reference intake, which is really to allow the consumer identify how much of the nutrient or the vitamins and minerals are they getting compared to what they should be getting. And the other key message I want to make on this slide is that this is a closed list. These are the only nutrients that can go on this nutrition table. No other nutrient can go on there unless the Commission changes the legislation. So this is a complete closed list. As I said, the legal minimum in terms of nutrition is this table, and this could be your table with supplementary nutrients. In terms of the calculation, a food business operator will generally have manufacturer's analysis of the food, so you've gone to have lab testing. Now, once you have that test carried out, and once there's no change to the ingredients or the process to make the food, that nutrition declaration should stay with that food. If you make any substitution ingredients or you decide to use a different method to process, well, obviously that's going to affect the nutrition value. You can also use actual average values for the ingredients that you use, or a calculation from established data such as McCann-Widison or the other composition tables that we tend to use. Just to note as well that the nutrient declaration on your label should not deviate greatly. Now, there's obviously fluctuations in terms of seasonal issues for food products and certain ingredients, which might cause a slight fluctuation in the nutrient value. But there are tolerance values set down as EU guidelines, which we would use to determine if a food product is well outside of the declaration as to what you put on the label compared to what's in the actual food. So just to be mindful that this is something that would be checked as well, and your inspector might be looking at your lab report. In terms of voluntary principal field of information, you may be familiar with seeing something like this on the front of a label. And again, the FIC legislation permits voluntary front of pack repeating of nutrient information. But if you choose to declare that on the front of your pack, you can only use the specified nutrients. So it can either be energy only, or energy plus your 4 fat, saturated sugar and salt. You can't at any stage just decide, well, I'd like to just put the sugar on the front of the pack or the energy value. You have to, if you're going to use it as a voluntary measure, you must follow the rules. You may also be familiar with seeing the bottom line there with the energy plus the other 4 nutrients in a coloured scheme, which is typical of what the UK would use. It's a voluntary traffic light system for nutrient declaration. And again, you might see that on many food products. But again, remember, it is voluntary, but if you choose to use it, you must follow the rules. Okay, just very quickly, as I said, it's so vast, the subject. What other things could you be thinking about with your food? You might be talking about, is your food packaged in certain gases? Do you use sweeteners? And if you do, you must indicate that near the name of the food. Are there other product compositional requirements? And there are for the likes of jam, chocolate, fruit juice, honey. So there are specific labeling rules in the compositional requirements. So just to be mindful, if you have a specific production method such as organic, novel, if your fish is farmed or caught wild, you must also have this indication. So just to be aware that there are a number of supporting pieces of legislation that will also have labeling requirements. So again, it adds to the interesting subject of food labeling. So very quickly, nutrition and health claims now, and again, even though, as I said at the outset, we've moved slightly away from the FIC legislation, but at the same time, it's what ends up on your food product. If we have a look at something like this, Guinness for strength, eat me and grow taller, or diet water. Okay, these are just some examples that we found over the past. There are many different claims being made on food products now. But if you want to make a claim on food, you must comply with Regulation 1924 of 2006 to be allowed to make that claim on your food. So a nutrition claim versus a health claim. The nutrition is really a claim whereby the food provides or contains a certain nutrient. For example, it's a source of iron or contains vitamin D. On the other hand, a health claim is the relationship between a food and health. Okay, and in this case, it would be the example, iron contributes to normal cognitive function, or vitamin D contributes to the maintenance of normal bones. So you can see the difference that in the nutrition claim, you're just stating the fact of that it is a source or it contains, and the health claim is a little bit more different in that there are a number of different criteria. The nutrition claims are a little bit more straightforward in that in the annex to Regulation 1924, there's a full list of the permitted claims. If the nutrition claim is not on this list, you cannot use it, but if it is, you can use it, and you must make sure your food product complies with the criteria. So if we take, for example, the last example there, low fat, you can say low fat on your food, provided there is no more than 3 grams of fat per 100 grams for a solid food, and no more than 1.5 grams of fat for a liquid food. So again, more straightforward, you have a full list in the annex. If it's on the list and you match the criteria, you're permitted to use it on your food. The health claims is a little bit. There are a number of different claims that have been authorised at EU level for use, and they're listed here in the EU Register of Claims, but there are also a number of claims that have not been authorised, so therefore they cannot be used on food labels. You would need to identify your food or your nutrient within the EU Register, identify what claim is permitted if it is authorised, and what is the wording that you can use on that claim. You are not permitted to change the wording greatly so that it would overemphasize the food, but it's important then to be able to check that that's in there. So the EU Register is available online. I've put up an example here of what a claim might look like. Now it's just an example that we would use in our guidance document. You will see here that there is nutrition declaration as required by FIC, but you'll also see that it says high in protein, which contributes to the maintenance of normal bones. Okay, so it's not saying that it's high in protein, which increases bone strength, or any other wording that could overemphasize the claim. You must stick within the wording, and if the claim is authorized for use for your food or your nutrient, it's fine to use it once you meet all of the general criteria that's set down in the legislation. So again, you can see how a number of claims on food products that wouldn't be authorized, they're not permitted for use. So I think at this stage, I just want to really, there's a lot of information there to talk about. It's everything that could typically be on a food label. I want to just talk to you a little bit about some of the FSAI resources. Obviously, I've mentioned the website, which has a wealth of information in terms of links to all of the booklets I mentioned, but indeed our legislation section on our website, should you need to get access to any of the pieces of legislation. But what I'd also like just to draw your attention to, and I'm not sure if you're aware of our online e-learning modules on FIC and nutrition labelling, which are invaluable. If you haven't gone through them, I'd really recommend you can use it at your own pace, your own time, and it sets a few examples, but it's a really good user-friendly tool to be able to identify what has to go on a label, and maybe to kind of give you some examples of what shouldn't go on a label. So again, just to be sure that if you haven't accessed that, again, if you have any queries after today, hopefully there'll be a few questions now at the end, but please feel free to email info@fsai.ie. We have a 5 working day turnaround time, and we do our best to get back to the queries, or fill in our contact us form. So I think that just brings us now at this point to the Q&A. So thank you for listening to me, and I think we're going to log back in a minute. I'm going to put back on my camera. So there's Elaine. Thanks, Elaine.
Hi, Clodagh. Well done. That was excellent. So I can see from all your questions in the chat that our audience are extremely engaged. I have a number of questions to put to you. Unfortunately, we won't get to them all today as we are running low on time, but I'm going to pick out a few. And for anybody that we don't get to, you can send an email to info@fsai.ie and we will get to you. So Clodagh, the first question here says, can the label still declare contains egg, milk and soya, even when these allergens are highlighted on the list of ingredients?
Okay, no, they can't. That's the quick answer. And the reason being is that where a food has to have a list of ingredients, you must highlight the allergens in there in the typeset. So there's no need, and there should not be, a contains list separate. It's only where a list of ingredients is not a mandatory requirement on a food product. In that case, you use the word contains and list the allergens.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much, Clodagh. The next one here is in relation to having allergen ingredients in bold. So the requester says, is it necessary to declare a statement such as for allergens, see ingredients in bold? Do you put this on your product? Is it mandatory?
No, again, in this case, it's not mandatory, because the mandatory requirement is that you've highlighted the allergens in your list of ingredients. So whether you've used bold or a different color typeset, that is clearly identifying the information to the consumers. So there's no need. And in actual fact, it takes up space on a label when you're putting an additional statement to signpost the consumer. So that's not required either.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Clodagh. We have another question, and it's in relation to the nutrition table. So the asker says, can I add omega-3 fats to the nutrition table if a claim is made about them?
Okay, now for that one, and I did show in the slides that the nutrition table is a closed list when the supplementary nutrients are on there. So omega-3 can't actually go into that table, which is interesting, because in the nutrition and health claims legislation, you are permitted to make a claim about omega-3 or omega-6, provided you meet the criteria. So by making the claim, you must give the amount of omega-3, but you can't put it in the nutrition table. So in that case, what you must do is declare it in close proximity, so really underneath the table, but just not in it, unfortunately. So that's a bit of an anomaly, but it can't go into the nutrition table.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Nice and clear, Clodagh, that's great. Now we have a question on Made in Ireland. So the asker says, is Made in Ireland allowed on shelf-ready packaging without the overwritten statements?
Now, so what this is bringing us back to is the origin declaration under the new rules that came in this April. So that's Regulation 2018-775. So if you put Made in Ireland or Produced in Ireland on a final label, you are now being prompted to give the origin of the primary ingredient in addition, where it differs from the origin of the final food. So whatever label contains that made in Ireland, if the primary ingredient is not Irish, you are now required under law to put a different statement to say, you know, produced in Ireland using beef or chicken from wherever. And the specific rules set down how you present it on the label.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much, Clodagh. Then we have a question in relation, we have two questions actually in relation to kind of bakery goods. So the first one says, in supermarkets where they package bakery items in clear plastic bags at present due to COVID, they don't have any other information on the contents there. Should there be information with it, or what are the rules around this?
Okay, so if I've got that right, then it's any baked goods that they're put into individual little packages, maybe a croissant, so that people aren't touching or coughing over them. So in that case, that's bringing us back to our poll example of the loaf of bread, that it is pre-packaged technically or physically in a bag and it's sealed off. However, because it's packed on the premises from which it's sold, it falls in under that derogation. So even in our poll result, it was interesting to see that we had a 52% spread on you know what we considered. So it should really, by looking at it, be considered as a pre-packaged, but because it was packed on the premises from which it was sold, it's not required to have all of the information. But what I would say is that they should have allergen information available. If it's not on a shelf talker in front of where that packed off baked good is, it will be in a folder or something that the consumer should be able to find easily to identify allergen information on it.
Perfect, thanks very much, Clodagh. And you actually covered off the second question I was about to ask you in relation to the same topic there. So I'm going to do one final question. So the final question is in relation to front of pack. So the asker says, what about declaring a single nutrient on the front of the pack, such as the likes of protein and protein bars? Is this permitted?
Okay, well, this is actually an interesting one because we see this a lot. No, in the case of front of pack nutrition information, the legislation does have a provision that you can repeat nutrients, but there are only certain nutrients. So you can't pick and choose which ones you want to declare. You can have energy or the energy plus the 4. So in the case of protein, and as I said, we see that quite a lot on labels. Protein cannot just stand out on its own as a declaration of a nutrient on the front of pack. What you could find is that if the product is high in protein, or even a source of protein, and meets the criteria of the Nutrition and Health Claims legislation, it can make that claim on the front of the label, but it just can't call out the protein amount on its own on the front of pack. So I hope that makes sense to here. Yeah,
that's great. That's crystal clear. Thanks so much, Clodagh. So those of you whose questions we didn't get to, our apologies. But if you send an email to info@fsai.ie, we will come back to you in due course. Thank you so much for your engagement this morning in today's session. Just a couple of things before we go. So there will be a survey that launches after the event. We would really appreciate if you could fill that in. It just gives us some guidance in terms of labelling and what food businesses are aware of and are not aware of. So it helps us prepare more materials to help you out. This is probably our last breakfast bite of the autumn season. However, we are about to start a new series of Brexit bites over the next couple of weeks. So I believe the first one is on the 7th of October. So if you want to pop to our website, we have some more information there and you can sign up if you wish to attend. And so along the same line, please do make sure that you are signed up to our subscriptions for event alerts. That's www.fsai.ie/subscribe, and you will be signed up then to get alerts for any events that you wish to attend. And that really brings our event to a close. So thank you to Clodagh for giving her presentation today. And I suppose from the rest of us, from Clodagh, from Helen, from Jane, and from all the team at FSAI, goodbye and take care.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye bye.
Bye then.